Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Benjamin Balderas, product designer at Nolte, and I am in charge of this week's Lightning Talk. And we're going to be talking about minimalism, what it really is, where did it come from, and how we can use it, how we can leverage it to contribute to better experiences. So we all know the term minimalism, but do we really understand what it means and what is its real purpose? So, without going into much detail, I would like to begin with a brief introduction of how minimalism started. And it started as an art movement in New York in the 1960s, where artists consciously move away from abstract expressionism, meaning overt symbolism and expressive excess. So, we can recognize abstract expressionism in the works of Jackson Pollock, for example, or maybe from Kooning. As you can see, these are very expressive works of art, very filled with color and elements. And now the minimalism art movement's favor for the simple and the literal led to the sleek geometric works that we can now recognize as the minimalist aesthetics. For example, take a look at this one of the series of black paintings by Frank Stella, or how about this sculpture by Donald Judd. So you can see it's pretty simple, pretty clear, to the point that the movement's mantra became what you see is what you see. It's just is what it is. Later, the movement triumphed in America and Europe through the help of certain museums, curators, art dealers, and publications, to the point that later it spread to other disciplines, describing not only the plastic arts, but also architecture, graphic design, even film, industrial design. Like a very favorite of mine and a personal huge inspiration, Dieter Rams. Maybe you can recognize him by his work with the brand Brown. So you can see very clean, very nice aesthetics on his products. And now minimalism even is in lifestyles. You may have heard of the Japanese minimalist trend, where especially young people have like very few possessions, like a small apartment, just a few clothing, few furniture. So nowadays the term is colloquially used to refer to anything that is bare, that is stripped of its essentials, and much like the works of previous artists, architects, and designers. So how did minimalism got into digital design? Well, around the end of the 20th century, minimalism began to take shape as a trend within the field of human-computer interaction. For example, in the 90s, a researcher named John Carroll ideated a theory of minimalism while studying the ways people use technical training manuals. His theory suggests that a successful design should support quick action by prioritizing brevity. Basically, this means that the training manuals will be designed so the content is only the necessary and that readers could easily identify the actions they needed to take. And in digital design, this can be translated as getting the interface out of the way in order to allow users to achieve their goals, which is like the core of user experience. Later, by the mid-2000s, minimalism started to appear in web interfaces in the form of larger negative spaces, lower amounts of content, restricted color palettes. You can take a look at this example from Google. I think this is the home screen from 1999. And you can see it's not great looking, but it's a long way from what we were used to seeing in the 90s in terms of websites. Later on, the emergence of responsive web design around 2010 triggered a greater appreciation for minimalist approach. So, for example, distractions and other embellishments that designers could get away with in desktop layouts became problems in mobile, obviously because of the much smaller screens. So slowly designers' preferences began to lean towards greater simplicity in websites. Even in other products like systems, like operating systems. We can all remember the highly criticized release of iOS 7 or the infamous release of Windows 8, which was not well received. It had major problems, but the important thing is that it was a major step towards making interfaces simpler. Today, minimalism design principles are now showing up in all sorts of sites and mobile applications. And what I want to really look here is what are their characteristics and how this can be used to make better experiences. So what are the characteristics? A study made by the Nielsen Norman Group, where they analyzed around 112 websites, revealed that the defining features of minimalism in digital products are flat elements, limited color schemes, few UI elements, use of negative space, dramatic typography. And let's briefly take a look at these aspects and how they can be effectively implemented in design. Flat elements or flat visuals. By this we mean the loss of skeuomorphism, limited or no color gradients, and a very important thing to consider is clear, clickable, and tappable targets. This is important because when going flat on a design, we risk losing detail and depth, which means that certain UI elements that are meant to stand out are at risk. It is important to not overdo the flat aesthetic and take care of the usability first. In this example from Buffer, there's a pretty cool use of bold colors, subtle shadows. This helps with visual hierarchy, so you see nothing is really lost. It's kind of flat, but it has a certain level of depth. Limited color schemes, this is pretty self-describing, sticking to the use of only one or two colors and letting the content do the talking. You can see in this example how Shopify achieved a neat-looking site with really just a couple of colors, maybe also using a few shades of a primary color. So for example, we see the background is this deep blue, and then the button on the top that says start free trial is kind of like a subdued version of the same color. A few UI elements, these refer to eliminating any elements not required to support core functionalities. And for context, we refer to UI elements as individual units of an interface. For example, it can be menu items, graphics, buttons, etc. Similar to the flat aesthetic, we have to be very careful not to overdo this and end up removing important elements that help convey messages or that facilitate a user task. Take a look at this example from a writer named Alan Trotter. You can judge by yourselves whether this is overdone or not, but just the simple idea of that when necessary or when applicable, some things can be as clean and simple as this, it's very interesting to look at. Use of negative space. By using negative space, we can direct users' attentions to where we want to, create optimal contrast. This is also very important and related to accessibility, and even convey a sense of ease or tranquility. Probably the greatest example for this is Apple's website, which we can see in this slide. Very, very clean and very centered on what we really want to look at. As a quick note, negative space doesn't have to be white. It can also be black or even any other color as long as it is appropriately used as an empty area. And last but not least, dramatic typography, which is characterized as usually sans serif fonts, large and bold, and helping compensate for the scarcity of graphics. So if we don't have a lot of photography or illustrations, this dramatic typography can come in and help compensate for that. Um, so as you can see, minimalism is about more than just visual aesthetics. Minimalist design is a strategy, it's a choice, and one that entails being as clear as possible but with as little as possible. A good minimalist design strategy will seek to simplify interfaces by removing unnecessary elements or even unnecessary content that does not support user tasks. And just as a last note, I think we, as producers of digital products, we have a great commission of creating products that don't contribute much to the user's already heavy cognitive load. We all know that we live in an era where we are constantly bombarded with a ton of stuff. So let's look into ways on how we can improve experiences and even lives by taking a minimalist approach, by helping reduce stress, reduce agitation and frustration with thoughtful minimalism. That's it. Thank you. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to post them in the comment section in YouTube. Elizabeth Chuk asks, many people in tech complain that websites have been reduced to a few very similar layouts. Where does creativity fit into minimalist design? That's an amazing question. I think that a real creativity comes when you have like a set of constraints. Well, there are two factors here, I think. One is that a lot of websites look similar because the web has evolved to the point where we collectively as humans, we started recognizing certain patterns. And when a designer goes outside certain patterns, it can be detrimental to the experience. And then real creativity comes with working with these constraints and finding new ways, like within these same patterns, looking into how we can innovate, make things better within the set of rules that we already have. I don't know, like this example to me is amazing because it's very, very simple, and it also lets you know that some elements are clickable. So you cannot see here, but if you go into the website, when you click in any of those underlined words, you get more words. Like you began adding to the sentence. And that is like a very amazing solution, I think. It's a very creative solution. It's minimal, but it also has an element of creativity. Okay, Jeff asks, what is your opinion on the non-visual UI and how that plays into minimalism, such as Snapchat or Instagram? Well, can you explain a bit more what you mean by non-visual UI? Meanwhile, I'll read another question from Nelson. What do you think comes next? Minimalism in digital design? Are there any trends that can change this style? Certainly, I think so. Like I said, the web has been evolving. Before having these flat aesthetics, we had like skeuomorphism, where digital stuff resembled physical stuff. Greatly because people weren't really used to digital stuff, so it was easy to convey a notepad, like for example a notepad app that looked like a real notepad, right? Now we all know how a notepad works, how an application works, and we don't need that skeuomorphism anymore. Now we have these flat aesthetics and more minimalism designs. I just think that the web can evolve to a different stage. Maybe some people have been talking about maybe even going back to intros. Like, remember when websites had intros before? Maybe adding a little bit more. You can see there's more animation now. There are more, I don't know, scrolling effects, stuff like that. Okay, so Jeff's question is, what is your opinion on non-visual UI and how that plays into minimalism? For example, swipe interactions, removal of typical UI elements such as buttons, tabs. Voice UI is another example of non-visual UI. Yeah, I think these same principles can be applied to like voice UI, for example, or to swipe interactions. I think that the core thing of minimalism is to creatively convey an effective message without having to do much. So, for example, if we're talking about a swipe interaction, instead of adding like arrows, we can just make kind of like a stack of cards that resembles, I don't know, that tells the user that you can swipe or sort different cards. In terms of UI, I honestly haven't looked, I mean, in terms of voice UI, I haven't looked into that much, but I believe that the same principles can apply. That's a very interesting thought. I'm certainly gonna research that. Okay. If there are no more questions or comments, we'll leave it at this. Thank you very much, everyone.